everyone, to people at home on Zoom, to our first guest lecture of the academic year. We have more to come, but today it's our great pleasure to welcome Dr. Shenila Khoja-Moolji as our first speaker. She is the Hamad bin Khalifa Al-Thani Associate Professor of Muslim Societies at Georgetown. And she researches and writes about the interplay of gender, race, religion, and power in Muslim populations in South Asia and the North American diaspora. She is the author of two other award-winning books, Forging the Ideal Educated Girl, The Production of Desirable Subjects in Muslim South Asia, and Sovereign Attachments, Masculinity, Muslimness, and Effective Politics in Pakistan. But today, she's going to talk to us about her most recent book, Rebuilding Community. And I want to make sure I get Displaced Muslim Women and the Making of a Shia Ismaili Muslim Sociality. Okay, so welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Depig and Professor Hamdani for the invitation. I also wanted to thank Medan for featuring a book forum on the book. So it's particularly delightful for me to be here. I will speak for about 30 minutes and then we can do Q&A. So this project was inspired by my grandmother, and that's my grandmother. In 1971, Nani, along with my mother, who was 12 years old at the time, she had to flee East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, due to a war. Nani was already a widow at the time, caring for 5 young children while working at a restaurant. The war, as can be expected, jolted this family, which was already always on the brink of poverty. But when Nani and her family landed in Karachi, members of the Shia Ismaili Muslim community formed a web of care around them. They were first taken to a refugee camp at a Jamat Khana, and this is the Gardenese Jamat Khana where they were taken. They were given food and clothing, and my mom still remembers, and she tells me that they were given 3 hot meals. And so the memory of those 3 hot meals for the 3 weeks that she was at the camp is seared in her memory. An ad hoc volunteer committee of displaced people themselves had come together to help other displaced families. And that ad hoc committee found a studio for my Nani. And so this is the building where my Nani lived in a studio apartment with her children. I took this photo in 2019 when I was interviewing the apartment's current residents, and they were Afghan refugees this time, also being supported by the Ismaili Jamat. In the meantime, there was another Ismaili woman who helped my Nani find work as a housekeeper. The same committee that I talked about, they also helped enroll my mother in an Ismaili-run boarding school and provided tuition fees for several months. In this photo, you see my mother in the white hairband. She and the other girls from East Pakistan, they had been asked to stay back that summer so they could learn the Urdu language. So they could speak it, but they didn't know the script. And so they were here. This is their first summer in West Pakistan. They're staying back at school to learn the Urdu language. The lives of displaced working-class Muslim women like my Nani, a widow with 5 children, engaged in the informal economy, working as a domestic aide, always on the brink of falling deeper into poverty, are often not recorded within national or even religious histories. From our histories is the labor of everyday women who supported displaced coreligionists. It's not that these women are forgotten. They're indeed remembered and celebrated by family members, but they have not yet entered the official record of Ismailis. It was this potential loss of women's history, recognizing that their lives and community building effort would disappear unrecorded and unarchived, that motivated me to write this. Relatedly, I also wanted to highlight the labor of displaced people themselves in rebuilding their community. Most studies of displaced people narrow in on the resources that the state or other agencies provide to them, or the contractual obligations that the state and dislocated people have. The tasks of biological and cultural reproduction, mutual aid, spiritual care, often performed by women, are comparatively absent from studies of resettlement. So in this book, I wanted to highlight such ordinary care work and its connection to religion in the fact refugee emplacement. My over 90 interlocutors fled East Pakistan and East Africa in the 1970s due to civil war and expulsion. Even though they are separated from thousands of miles of land and sea, they share ethnicity and religious tradition. They are Shia Ismaili Muslims who trace their ancestors to the Sindh-Gujarat corridor. Shia Muslims are a historical religious minority. Upon the death of Prophet Muhammad, a small group of his followers sided with his son-in-law, Ali ibn Abi Talib, as the rightful leader of the community. The majority favored the Prophet's old friend, Abu Bakr, who ultimately took on leadership of Muslims as the first caliph. Ali's followers continued to seek guidance from him and his successors, and their identity consolidated over time as Shiat Ali, or Party of Ali, also known as Shia, while the other interpretation of Islam coalesced into what's today known as the people of the Sunnah and the community, or Sunni. The Shia, over time, split into further groups as divisions developed over rightful successors. My interlocutors belong to the Nizari Ismaili group of Shias, who today are estimated to be between 12 and 15 million in number and spread globally. Their present imam, or spiritual leader, is the 49th imam in direct succession from the Prophet. From the 11th century onward, the Nizari Ismaili imams, first located in Egypt and then in Persia, sent out missionaries to various regions, including to the Indian subcontinent. A 15th century missionary conferred the title of Khwaja, Persian for Lord or Master, to a group of his Indian followers, which over time was modified to Khoja. Over the course of centuries, Khojas migrated from Kashmir and Punjab down the Indus River Valley to the Sindh-Gujarat corridor and settled there, engaging in subsistence farming or working as petty traders and farm laborers. Epidemics and famines in the region in the late 19th century weakened the economic prospects of the community there, and greater numbers of Khojas headed to urban cities in India and to the Gulf and Swahili coasts. This was, of course, also facilitated by increased Indian Ocean trading activity in the Indian Ocean. Later, during the 1940s and 50s, some of these Ismaili families, like my nannies, relocated again to escape the violence that accompanied the partition of India. So by 1970s, we have a sizable number of Ismailis in East Pakistan and in East Africa, and both of these cohort now will have to flee again due to specific political turmoils in these two regions, but they will meet in North America as they recreate Jamat Khanas in North America. So that was one of the reasons why I kind of brought these two groups together. I interviewed women who belong to these two cohorts. I asked them about their lives and the memories they have of their mothers and grandmothers to understand the broader role that women have played in maintaining religious sociality across generations and across continents. And so the mothers and grandmother group, which was also migrating, is also understudied. And so I wanted to get a sense of that cohort as well. So in the book, I ask, how do people survive dislocations? How do they remake their spiritual and social life worlds? What kinds of material, cultural, and emotional work do women in particular undertake to regenerate a sense of self and community? What can a closer examination of women's activities teach us about lived ethics, the formation of religious communities, and about practices of care? The book makes at least two interventions. Its first intervention is in relation to how we study refugee placemaking. Studies about refugees often focus on contractual relationships between refugees and states, or when considering placemaking, we learn about how refugees transform their built environments, particularly public spaces, so that it reflects their needs and aspirations. Viewed from this lens, diasporic Ismailis have carved their place along migratory routes by establishing Jamat Khanas and social welfare institutions. But I extend the concept of placemaking beyond the construction of physical infrastructure to include ordinary acts of care that sustain connection among people and to ideas. Ideas such as, what does it mean for me to be an Ismaili? What does it mean for me to be a part of a religious community? I argue that it is through everyday actions, cooking for a lost traveler, helping a young widow set up a dukkha, telling a mojiza story, passing on heritage food recipe, that Ismaili women have iterated community. And here I'm informed by Vered Ahmed and Brian Allen, who has suggested that while religious community is a repository for meaning and a marker of identity for many people, it is not a given. And as scholars, we have to explain how community is empirically formed. And so in the book, I focus on the case of Ismaili women. Notice how the Ismaili religious community is made and remade in the here and now, but also symbolically. The second offering that I make is in relation to how, when we look at women's practices, we discover the lived dimension of the Ismaili faith. In addition to prayers, which are often the focus of studies on Muslim piety, we encounter women enacting their faith through mundane reproductive activities. These are care activities through which they not only express their faith, but also try to work out what their faith or deen actually is. Placemaking after displacement then becomes a scenario for me to theorize an Ismaili ethics of care. While my thinking is shaped by feminist theorizing on ethics of care, I look to the zone of religion for additional morally compelling pathways to care and to the practice of collective social life. When my interlocutors explain the motivations for their actions, the Imam's farmans or directives on unity of community and support for its members appear as salient sources of guidance in addition to the Ginans, which are devotional literature, and the Quran. The Ismaili sociality that I describe has a strong collectivist impetus, in part due to the central authority of the Shia Imam. It is helpful here to understand that obedience to the Imam is a key tenet of Shia Ismaili spirituality. When the Imam urges his followers to support the weakest member of the community, to be united, to show generosity, or to engage in mutual support, the statements are understood as directives and not optional practices, as my interlocutor Dilshad Sadruddin repeatedly emphasized to me. Quote, when a farman comes from the Imam, that's it, you must follow it. This allegiance unites all Ismaili Muslims worldwide. I therefore read my interlocutors' practices as expressing an ethic of care for community that is uniquely Ismaili in its motivations, if not necessarily in the service tasks that it motivates. This is not to say that my interlocutors rationalized all their actions by reference to Islam. Indeed, other sources of moral guidance, encounters with other religious traditions and practitioners, or the gifts or even sympathetic words from a neighbor also have a place in framing Ismaili women's ethical practices. The idiosyncratic dimensions of everyday life also influence them. It's helpful, therefore, to understand the Ismaili ethics practiced by my interlocutors, not as delinked from everyday life, Indic intellectual traditions, and other moral frameworks, but instead as intersecting with them as sources for reflection and action. Recognizing this dense landscape of moral guidance does not preclude observing that certain pronouncements, such as the Imam's directives, do take discursive dominance in many of my interlocutors' lives. What this approach offers is the possibility of recognizing Islam as an overwhelming presence in women's lives, while not reducing everything that they do to a single explanatory framework. So let me give you a sense of the broader arc of the book, and then I'll share a specific example. So after introducing the book, in the second chapter, I traced the childhoods of the women I interviewed and their memories of their foremothers to reconstruct their lives in forced migration. This older story of Ismaili migrations is often told from the perspective of empire, celebrating Ismaili men who thrived in the colonial political economy. I instead home in on women's everyday lives to show how they reinforced communal affinities while cultivating ethical sensibilities. How Mitibai Premji of Mombasa and Taj Bibi Abu Ali Aziz of Dar es Salaam took in boarders from smaller towns so they could attend school. How Shir Banu Lalani kept one box for religious dues and one box for household expenditures so that religious dues don't get mixed up with money available to buy soap. And how Ismaili women grappled with the directives of their Imam when he asked them to drop the face veil. I then move on to accounts of how Ismailis fled East Pakistan and East Africa. These include traumatic experiences from witnessing killings while fleeing under the cover of night to surviving on ketchup packets for days on end. But women also remembered the generosity of strangers and coreligionists. I have captured some of these episodes. I could have actually written an entire book about these traumatic experiences, but I've tried to capture some of these so that my readers can understand how the effort of placemaking that they will see in the rest of the chapters, it flows besides these stories of trauma and hardship. In this image, for example, you see Umida Switlo, and she's showing the one bag that she was able to flee with. And she's really proud she's kept this bag all this time because when compared to refugees from Burma, she notes that, but at least I had a bag, they only had a couple of shopping bags. And so for her, she's kept this bag precisely because she thinks of it as a blessing as well. Chapter 3 examines women's efforts to create and sustain Jamat Khanas across generations, first in East Africa and then in North America. It introduces women who created makeshift Jamat khanas at their apartments in Atlanta and Fort Wayne, in addition to practices of laying down bed sheets so that community members could sit on the floor, or trimming the legs of a coffee table to make it resemble a pat, which is a ritual table. Placemaking included reciting dua, burning incense, and sharing food. Ismailis conjured the sacred sensorium of the Jamaat Khana even during flight on steamboats and refugee camps by reciting devotional literature, participating in religious classes, and celebrating festivals. Chapter 4 outlines placemaking through miracle stories. I include stories of miraculous rescues as Ismailis were trapped in Jamaat Khanas, as well as unexpected aid from strangers during the early years of resettlement. These stories reinforce faith in God's and Imam's protective care. Their retelling not only memorializes a shared past, but also shapes the future spiritual state of the Ismaili community in the form of when the retelling takes place. In Chapter 5, I examine cookbooks written by 3 displaced Ismaili women from East Africa, through which they introduce readers to histories of community life in India and East Africa, pass on heritage food practices, and even share the Imam's advice on nutrition. Chapter 6 explores placemaking in the second generation. So these are the daughters of my primary interlocutors, and to examine how they engage with communal pasts while simultaneously interrogating and celebrating a shared history in novels, artworks, and dissertations. Having grown up in North America, this generation articulates an Ismaili ethics of care that is informed by their ancestors, but also intersects with locally manifest concerns around anti-brown and anti-Black racism, and engages in a critique of settler colonialism and the model minority paradigm. So overall, then, this book is looking at a cohort of Ismaili women and their ordinary practices of care in the context of displacement to tell a broader story about religious ethics and spiritualized socialities. So I'll now take you through a few pages from one of the chapters. So this is chapter 3. In late 1960s, as anti-Asian sentiments were on the rise in Tanzania, Gulzar Qasim saw her chances of progressing in her career as a gynecologist diminish rapidly. She therefore considered leaving. With a couple of other Ismaili women doctors, she decided to take a test that could lead to medical residency in the United States. She passed and was accepted into a program at Emory University. And in 1972, along with her husband, Bahadur Qasim, Gulzar made her way to Atlanta. Through a contact at the Emory Library, Gulzar connected with 2 other Ismailis in the area, and they decided to get together at Gulzar's place. Gulzar recalls in an interview with me, "We thought maybe we should meet every week, and maybe we should probably do dua together. And we all got excited about it. And we said, fine. RK was a great cook, so she would cook, and I would be her helper. And then every weekend we would meet." While initially this gathering included only Gulzar's immediate family and a couple of other Ismailis, they were soon joined by another 4 students who had moved to Atlanta. Gulzar describes this first congregation of 12 people. "We all said dua and tasbih, and then we would have our dinner. And mind you, we were not all very religious or anything. We have evolved a lot. But at least we knew about getting together and having food and doing, saying our prayers together." Here, Gulzar mobilizes a different meaning of being religious, one that conjoins performing prayers with commensality and community, positioning this practice of religion against understandings that might limit it to the domain of formal prayers or exclude social life from its ambit. Iqbal Paru, then a student at Georgia State University and a member of this small congregation, remembers looking forward to those gatherings as a chance to enjoy Indian food. Gulzar would cook biryani and samosa, so I would say, "I'm coming." And she used to even pack food for me to take home, so I always had food for the next day. It was the only good food that I got. They, Gulzar and Bahadur, really took me under their wings. As more Ismailis arrived from East Africa, the makeshift Jamaat Khana moved to another congregant's apartment, and Iqbal Paru and Gulzar Qasim were officially appointed as its faith ministers. In 1973, several refugees from Uganda joined this small congregation. They wanted more for their Jamaat Khanas, a larger space and daily services. The Jamaat Khana thus moved to yet another location, a house on Lisbon Street. That's the one that you see here. Gulzar recalls that while the request for daily morning and evening services came from the patriarchs of the Ugandan refugee families, it was actually their wives who did the work that kept the Jamaat Khana running. Quote, one person would be in charge of cleanup and do everything. We vacuumed every time after Khane, so they would vacuum. It was mainly done by women, like food offerings and all that stuff. So that really created the environment that we were used to traditionally. And in fact, whoever came early did the incense or the agarbatti. We always had agarbatti. So we ran the Jamaat Khana as a very formal place, and the women basically kept it clean and went on with the traditions. Gulzar's recollections show how the seemingly quotidian activities of praying, of preparing food offerings, vacuuming, cleaning, and burning incense, just as they had done in East Africa, evoked imaginings associated with the Jamaat Khana. As geographer Phil Hubbard has suggested, place emerges as a particular form of space through acts of naming, as well as through the distinctive activities and imaginings associated with particular spaces. For the newly transplanted Ismailis in Atlanta, burning agarbatti was a sensory reminder of Jamaat Khanas in East Africa. It transformed a repurposed house or a storefront into a spiritual place. Thus, women's seemingly routine activities maintained spiritual connection and fashioned a continuity of traditions, as Gulzar's words remind us. In the book, I actually share a lot more about the makeshift Jamaat Khana in Fort Wayne as well, where Roshan Pirani was the faith minister who created the Jamaat Khana in her home. But I'm going to just zoom out and talk about some of the broader findings of the chapter. Establishing makeshift sacred spaces, according to cultural geographer Rhys Jones, entails a negotiation between sacred acts and profane settings, challenging the established notion of sacred space as absolute space. We see in Gulzar and Roshan examples as they challenge the idea that space is absolutely sacred or profane, asserting through their actions that by adapting sacred conventions, they can temporarily and repeatedly make their living rooms a place where the sacred can transpire. Scholar Parin Mavani argues that the experience shared in the Jamaat Khana, the atmosphere created therein, cannot be reconstructed in any other place. Even a temporary construction, the Ismaili Jamaat Khana, even as a temporary construction, the Ismaili Jamaat Khana is a material site within a boundary. In this sense, as Mawani suggests, the Jamaat Khana is physically distinct and a salient Ismaili infrastructure of worship and care. But because God is omnipresent, any space carries the potential to be transformed into a threshold between mortal and eternal worlds. Specifically, the sensorium of the Jamaat Khana can be conjured, shared, and transmitted by and through a collective of Ismaili practitioners. Thus, while I agree that Mawani that Jamaat Khana carries a distinct quality as a physical site, I also suggest that we recognize the potential for this sacred space to exist separate from fixed dedicated structures, as we have seen in the case of the makeshift Jamaat Khana in Atlanta, and indeed to exist separate from any physical structure at all. The soothing fragrance of agarbatti, communal recitations of Ginan, bodies collectively falling in prostration or swaying zikr, and commensal eating are the auditory, visual, and bodily acts and rituals through which practitioners can summon the sensory structure of the Jamaat Khana, even outside its material boundaries. We see this on board a ship leaving Chittagong for Karachi. Many of my interlocutors remember scrambling to pack their bags in April and May of 1971 and making their way to the dock, hoping to escape the riots that had broken out in Chittagong. They were headed for the Shams steamer. As expected, the ships that were leaving the city were packed, food and water ran short, with shortages exacerbated by a journey that was longer than usual, 12 days instead of the usual 8 days, because the steamer was not allowed to cross Indian waters and ended up briefly lost at sea. Passengers were sick and vomiting. Adding to the inevitable anxiety about heading into an uncertain future, women were further distressed because their spouses and male children had remained behind in Chittagong, either hoping to sell some of their family possessions or simply because there were so few seats available on the steamers. In these tumultuous times, the predominantly Ismaili and predominantly female passengers of the ship would invoke divine through collective and communal prayers and through expressions of care for each other. Roshan Pirani remembers, Every day we would do our dua, tasbih, ginan. Ginans are hymn-like poems of varying lengths, often recited during formal congregation services. They have a central role in Ismaili religious life and rituals and are considered texts through which the peers conveyed the teachings of Islam. Ginans thus have a didactic and doctrinal purpose, along with acting as a medium for communication with the divine. Roshan recalls seeing women crying and often reciting Ginans to soothe themselves. Another Ismaili woman who fled on the same steamer as Roshan explains, the chanting of the Ginans created an atmosphere that comforted us like a Jamat Khana. Roshan also recalls the presence of two Ismaili Vaizin or itinerant preachers among the passengers. They not only provided pastoral care, but continued to hold the religious education classes that they had offered back in the Jamaat Khana on the steamer too. Roshan had been their student, and now the onboard classes provided her a sense of familiarity and a continuity. During these tense moments, Ismaili women also reinvigorated already familiar forms of commensal eating and care to sustain community. JK recalls that she had received news from members of the Jamaat who had left on an earlier ship that food would run short, and so she and four of her friends cooked dry snacks to share with everyone. The sensory and somatic dimensions of religious experience have long been recognized in the study of religion in South Asia. Srinivas posits religion as also an experience of the senses and argues that while there is no single sensorium of the sacred, it is possible to identify elements of experience that are historically shared by a group of practitioners. Such a sensorium tied to memories of places and bodies can connect practitioners of a shared tradition to each other and to a collective past. On board the Shams steamer, singing the Anand Akaro Ginan under the stars on a wet and crowded deck, paying attention to Awais and sharing Chevro, united passengers in their memories of Jamat Khana and Chittagong, reinforced bonds with each others and belief in divine intervention. Many of my interlocutors described these ordinary placemaking activities as seva. Seva is a Sanskrit word used to express devotion and service to a supreme deity with whom the devotee has a personal relationship. This term is used by contemporary Ismaili Muslims of South Asian descent to denote service to the Imam as well as to the individuals and institutions in the Ismaili community and beyond. When I asked JA about why she used the term seva to describe her work on the Jamaat Khana cleaning committee, she explained, seva is good works that are a form of prayer. Seva is sreva. She then proceeded to explain this wordplay to me by reciting a verse from a Ginan in which the term sreva, which means to worship, is used. Eji kahore jivatame kis karan aya ji, na kidi sahib jini sreva ji. O man, if you did not worship the Lord, then say, why have you come? JA appears to understand seva as broadly equivalent to ethical conduct, which in turn is recognized as a form of worship because it's anchored in a consciousness of the Lord. Many Ismailis also understand seva as opportunities given by the Imam to elevate their souls. In doing so, they evince a mode of religiosity where good actions are directed not just by personal intentions or niyat, but also made possible by the Imam. We thus observe the limits of human intentionality as space is made for divine agency, which arrives via the Imam. Consider my interview with Khurshid Bimani. Khurshid arrived in New York from Tanzania in 1971. In the months that followed, she built a secure position for herself at her new job, helped fellow Ismailis obtain legal documentations, and organize outings for the community. Khurshid went on to serve on numerous Ismaili institutions over the next several decades. During our meeting, she described her expansive and extensive work as seva. When I asked her what seva has meant to her, she says, a blessing. She then mentions a directive from the previous Imam, Sultan Muhammad Shah, in which he had said, when I am happy with somebody, I give seva. When I am happier, I give them more seva. Even though a believer's niyat or intent is considered a defining element of seva, Khurshid's reference to this farman shows that she received the seva also as a favor from the Imam. Agency for pious effort then does not rest solely with the individual, but emerges in a dynamic relationship with the Imam. Because seva is offered by the imam, women tell me of moments when the imam eased the difficulties they encountered during their volunteer work. At the time that Gulzar was serving as faith minister for Atlanta, she was also a full-time hospital resident. She would rush home from the Jamat Khana still in her work clothes to perform her duties with no time in between to rest, eat, or change. Another woman who also served as faith ministers tells me of being so tired at the end of the day that she would, quote, fall in a pile of clothes and sleep right there. But then she said that upon entering the Jamaat Khana, her tiredness would just disappear. My interlocutors explain these transformations to be by using phrases such as the barakah or blessings of seva, or feeling Maula's hand on my shoulders, or an invisible bubble around me. These phrases point to a metaphysical source intervening and guiding women through the difficulties of their volunteer service. I'm going to, given the time, just move to. At first glance, many of the activities that we have discussed, cooking, cleaning, washing, vacuuming, for instance, seem to reinforce women's gendered participation in Ismaili religious life. But we can acknowledge that women performed different services than men in Ismaili settings, and at the same time recognize that women's services were meaningful ways through which they enacted devotion to the imam and the community. As one of my interlocutors commented, quote, women like us who clean the Jamaat Khana are a means, zaria, for the spiritual development of others. Our hard work facilitates everyone's prayers. So in a way, we get the barakah of all of those who pray in the Jamaat Khana, unquote. And we were actually sitting in the veranda after a safai or a cleaning committee day. Writing about Hindu women's religious labor in the kitchen, Anita Ghosh argues that while such spaces may indeed be gendered and the associated division of space and labor can bolster male privilege, women can also subvert and create their own socially specific meanings of that space. Through such work, women may acquire a very private space, be relieved temporarily from the burdens of their everyday life, and be in direct and private communion with God. Such private spaces and personal meanings emerged during my interviews with Ismaili women too. Women gained valuable skills through seva, which at the time enabled them to achieve economic independence from their husbands. One woman, for instance, was able to start her own cafe at a cinema based on the knowledge of organizational work that she gained from Jamaat Khana. Other women found personal autonomy away from the watchful eyes of their in-laws. Numerous women spoke of service affording them religiously permissible social opportunities to meet other women. So before closing, I should note that paying attention to women's contributions does not, of course, deny men's contributions to fostering sacred spaces in those early years of settlement. While women did most of the cooking, men set up the tables, took out the trash, and lifted heavy pots. Men's tasks, as Gulzar reminds us, included leading ceremonies, delivering sermons, driving congregants to and from services if no public transportation was available, and engaging with the US Council officials. These acts of care that men performed looked different from those performed by women, mediated perhaps by prevailing and historical gender roles and norms. At the same time, men have had access to a much wider range of service opportunities beyond the physical tasks associated with reproducing the Jamaat Khana in a new space. Men could hold leadership and decision-making positions, first as faith ministers of Jamaat Khanas, and then as the Ismaili community institutionalized its social governance work in the councils and other administrative bodies that took on this oversight. Women's participation has been comparatively circumscribed, with certain leadership positions available to them contingent solely on their relationship to men. Despite these constraints, women have always found a way to serve the Jamaat. There's so much more that I could say, but and I hope you'll read the book, but I'll just zoom out and talk about a couple of contributions that I hope to make. So first, when the history of Ismaili is written, it's written from the perspective of the imams, the missionaries, or elite men. But while these histories have accomplished a crucial task of clarifying the broad sequence and contours of events of Ismaili history, I add new dimensions to it through a partial reconstruction of Ismaili women's lives. Second, often women's placemaking activities take the form of reproductive tasks such as cleaning, cooking, and washing. Even though such work is necessary for the propagation of society, it is frequently viewed as a property of women's biology and is therefore undervalued. Marxist feminists have therefore regarded housework as a paradigmatic site for gendered exploitation and have sought to elevate its value by moving it into the realm of waged labor. I instead align with those feminist and religious studies scholars who refuse to reduce women's work to productivist logics. I mobilize a different logic altogether, viewing women's reproductive activities as producing relationality and sociability, repairing past trauma, functioning as a means of harnessing spirituality, and furnishing intergenerational continuity. The challenge for me is to recognize and emphasize the salience of this work and those who undertake it, while also pointing out the circumstances and scenarios when it becomes a site of exploitation. Finally, the role of religion in migrant and refugee placemaking remains underexplored. In relation to Muslim refugees, Islam is often mobilized to further demonize them. However, show a different side of Islam, where Islam offers resources to women to not only find solace and comfort during a difficult time, but it is also a code of conduct that helps them to suture their lives and communities back together. In this respect, I also note that there is an ongoingness and ordinariness to women's ethical conduct that extends beyond current analyses of Muslim charity and religiosity, which are dominated by, as Amira Mittermeier has said, the hegemonic paradigm of self-cultivation. Ismailis practice their deen both by working on themselves and by working intersubjectively to create community. Of course, such modes of religious intersubjectivity are not distinct to Ismailis. Muslims globally engage in ethical community making. But unlike other Muslim groups, within Ismailis, the Imam acts as a centripetal force that gives this community a distinct route to ethical action. Identifying an Ismaili ethics of care is not to argue that the community's particular understanding of spiritual obligation, honed in the diaspora, is wholly distinct from other modes of care developed in other communities. It is rather a close examination of one manner of living a Muslim life in which members of other communities or scholars who study them may identify points of commonality as well as difference. Thank you.